So for those of us at home, what would you say is the easiest first step that we can take to becoming more sustainably or to live more sustainably or be more eco-friendly?
Highly personally dependent, as you kind of alluded to. It's a really good idea to get a sense of what your biggest sources of emissions are in order to make that decision. For people who fly more than like once a year, flying will probably be the biggest place that you could impact your own personal emissions. Um, if you eat a lot of meat, then becoming vegetarian or vegan is probably the second biggest thing you can do. That's what I found for myself, at least. Um, if you happen to use a lot of electricity, maybe if you have electric vehicles, then switching to non fossil fueled sources of electricity, maybe getting solar on your roof, or maybe like paying a little bit of extra to your utility to get renewably generated electricity could be also a big source for you. Um, Again, though, I urge people to think of reducing your own emissions as one of maybe 5 or 6 things in your overall kind of portfolio of climate activism, which would include things like making sure that your investments are away from fossil fuels, trying to use banks that don't do a lot of fossil fuel investment, talking about climate change every chance you get, organizing at your workplace or in your church or in your family and friends group, for example. Going out and protesting would be another big one. And just in general, getting extremely creative about how you can use your own particular interests and your own networks, your own talents, your own resources to boost the climate movement as much as you possibly can. And I want to also add that there's a lot of tactics that I think the climate movement hasn't even discovered yet. And you might be the person who comes up with, a great idea that really pushes the movement to the next level.
So what do you think it will take to make this climate movement more mainstream and really catch on?
That's a great question. And I think that's what has to happen. When I first started down this path of climate activism, I had a lot of hope that world leaders would feel the panic of the Earth system breaking down in real time in their bones the way I do, and that they would take the action necessary, even potentially at the risk of their own career, just like I do. They haven't done that. They've definitely prioritized, for example, getting reelected or, doing what the corporate sort of donors want them to do, right? For example, as was portrayed brilliantly in the recent film Don't Look Up. So because of the influence of the fossil fuel industry in particular, in terms of the policy that we can get, I think it would be a mistake to just sit and wait for world leaders to do the right thing and get on the right side of history. Instead, we need that super powerful climate movement. And to me, one of the things that has to happen is conversations like this, for example. We need the message of urgency to get out in the mainstream, both in terms of the news media and in terms of the entertainment media. So I hope that, for example, again, Don't Look Up leads to a lot more climate stories being told in the mainstream through television, through movies. And then, I just think that if you're ever in a conversation, no matter who it is, whether it's a friend, whether it's a checkout person at the grocery store, it doesn't matter. If there's a way to bring up climate change and what an emergency it truly is, do so. Because I think that at some point we might reach a kind of social tipping point where, for example, it's no longer cool to burn fossil fuel. It's no longer cool to be forced to burn fossil fuel by these systems, where we want, the fossil fuel executives who've been lying to us for decades, for example, to be held accountable, as opposed to just raking in more and more profits. So I'm really all about revoking the social license of fossil fuel any way that we can.
I'm glad you mentioned the movie Don't Look Up because that really is something that's become mainstream. I think it was not Netflix's second biggest movie ever. And so watching that and finding the similarities and the comparisons between the life you're living and what was portrayed in the movie, how did you feel watching that?
It was absolutely cathartic for me. I was really surprised by that. I was definitely looking forward to watching the movie. Um, but after I did, it was a more emotional experience than I expected. I felt seen. I felt like, and then over the next few days, as it was clearly reaching a lot of viewers and being discussed a huge amount, I felt like this is the movement starting to go mainstream. Like finally, the discussion's broken out of sort of the fringe, like the small percentage of people who, for whatever reason, understood what an emergency this was, and it's starting to get to the mainstream because that's what we need. It's felt really crushing to be trying to like lift this load, essentially hold the world, along with a few other climate activists. It's been so much weight, and to feel like ignored from the mainstream. Several years ago, I'd often get laughed at. And people didn't. You bring it up at a party, for example, people don't want to keep talking to you, right? Because it was this kind of fringe thing, and now that it's starting to break through into the mainstream, and I hope that process continues. The battle is certainly not over. It's just one movie, but I do feel like it was a surprise. I didn't think that one movie could be such an important milestone in the climate movement, but I think in a year or two, when we look back on this, we might actually see it as a pretty important milestone.
We've got about 30 seconds left. What would you say is the final take-home message for our viewers?
Ah, there's don't underestimate how serious this is. I know there's a lot of huge problems in the world. For example, the pandemic is a huge problem. This, within a few years, is going to dwarf the pandemic.
Peter, thank you so much for being here and for all you've done.
Thank you so much for having me, Adam.